The world thinks broken people need saving. The truth is, sometimes they're the only ones who remember how to save someone else. The first time I saw Grace Carter, she looked like someone who had already lost everything worth losing. Not because her clothes were worn or because the paper coffee cup in her hands had gone cold hours before she finished it. It was the way she stood outside St. Matthew Medical Center at exactly 2:14 on a rainy Tuesday morning, staring at the emergency entrance as if walking inside required every ounce of courage she had left. I didn't know her name then. I didn't know that 5 days later she would quietly dismantle every rule I'd spent 34 years building around my life. I only remember thinking that no one should ever look that alone in a city filled with 8 million people. 5 days earlier, my calendar had been packed from sunrise until well after midnight. Board meetings. Investors. Acquisitions. Interviews. Every minute measured, every decision worth millions, every room falling silent when I entered. The headlines liked to call me America's youngest self-made billionaire. Business magazines praised my discipline. Financial reporters admired my ability to predict markets before anyone else. They all believed success sounded like applause. None of them had ever heard the silence inside my penthouse after midnight. Success echoed louder when no one was waiting for you to come home. My driver slowed the black Escalade beside a traffic light in downtown Manhattan while rain traced silver lines across the windows. Through the blurred glass I noticed a young woman struggling to keep several grocery bags from splitting open. One bag finally gave way, sending cans, fruit, and a loaf of bread rolling across the wet sidewalk. Hundreds of people walked past without stopping. Some glanced for less than a second before lowering their umbrellas and continuing home. New York had taught everyone the same lesson. Keep moving. Don't get involved. The woman sighed instead of crying. She knelt on the pavement, collecting each item with careful hands as though every orange and every dented soup can mattered. Something about that quiet determination unsettled me more than any dramatic display of emotion could have. My assistant looked up from his tablet. "Sir?" I realized the light had turned green several seconds earlier. Cars behind us began honking. "Nothing," I answered, even though it wasn't true. We drove away, but for reasons I couldn't explain, I glanced into the side mirror. She was still there. Still gathering what little she had. Still refusing to leave anything behind. That image followed me through 3 meetings, a charity luncheon, and an interview where someone asked what motivated me after achieving everything I'd ever wanted. I smiled the way successful men are expected to smile and gave them the polished answer they wanted. Growth. Innovation. Responsibility. None of it felt real. Because somewhere across the city, a woman I'd never met was teaching me a lesson without speaking a single word. And I had absolutely no idea that destiny had already begun rewriting both of our lives. The next morning arrived with bright sunshine that fooled everyone into believing the city had become kinder overnight. It had not. Manhattan simply wore different masks depending on the weather. My first meeting began at 7:30 sharp on the 48th floor, where polished marble reflected the skyline and executives waited with carefully rehearsed presentations. Numbers filled the screens. Charts climbed upward. Profits exceeded projections for the 8th consecutive quarter. Around the conference table, people smiled because success demanded celebration, but all I could think about was a woman kneeling on a rain-soaked sidewalk protecting a loaf of bread as though it were priceless. That image refused to leave me. By noon I canceled 2 lunches and dismissed everyone earlier than expected. My chief of staff looked genuinely concerned. He had worked beside me for 6 years and knew I almost never disrupted my schedule. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sinclair?" he asked. I nodded automatically. "I simply need some air." It was the first dishonest answer I had given in weeks. Instead of returning to the office after my meeting downtown, I walked several blocks alone, something my security team disliked but reluctantly accepted. The streets buzzed with delivery trucks, construction noise, food carts, and hurried conversations. Thousands of stories crossed the sidewalks every minute, each one invisible to everyone else. Then I saw her again. Grace stood outside a neighborhood grocery store wearing the same faded denim jacket from the night before. She studied a handwritten list, counted folded dollar bills twice, then quietly returned 2 items to the shelf before walking toward the register. There was no frustration on her face. Only careful acceptance, as though disappointment had become another routine expense. An elderly cashier smiled apologetically while handing back the items she could not afford. Grace thanked her anyway. Thanked her. Most people complained over delayed coffee orders worth $5. She expressed gratitude after giving up part of her dinner. I remained across the street, strangely unable to leave. "Sir," one of my security agents spoke softly through the earpiece. "Do you want us to move the vehicle?" "No." The answer came faster than I intended. "Stay where you are." Grace stepped outside carrying one small paper bag that looked far lighter than anyone's weekly groceries should have been. As she crossed the intersection, a little boy accidentally dropped his backpack, spilling notebooks across the crosswalk just as the pedestrian signal began flashing. Without hesitation, Grace set her own groceries on the sidewalk and helped him gather every notebook before sending him safely toward his waiting mother. The woman thanked her hurriedly and disappeared into the crowd without realizing Grace had missed the crossing signal herself. She simply waited for the next light, smiling faintly despite the delay. I found myself wondering when anyone had last stopped for her. Late that afternoon, my assistant placed a thin folder on my desk. "The community outreach proposals you requested," she said. I looked at the stack for several seconds before sliding one blank sheet from the printer beside me. Across the top I wrote the name of a neighborhood food assistance program I remembered supporting years earlier. Beneath it I signed an anonymous donation large enough to keep their shelves stocked for months. No press release. No photographs. No recognition. For the first time in years, writing my signature felt like it meant something beyond another business transaction. Yet even as I sealed the envelope, I knew the truth. I had not done it because I suddenly became generous. I had done it because somewhere in this enormous city lived a woman who had almost nothing, and somehow she had already begun changing a man who supposedly had everything. That evening I should have been reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but instead I stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office watching the lights of Manhattan flicker awake one by one. Every illuminated apartment represented a life I would never know, families sharing dinner, couples arguing over ordinary things, children laughing somewhere behind curtains. My office remained silent except for the quiet hum of the climate control system. Success had given me every luxury except the one thing money could never negotiate. Connection. My phone vibrated against the desk. It was my younger sister, Olivia. She called every Thursday whether I answered or not. "Have you eaten?" she asked before saying hello. I smiled despite myself. "That sounds more like our mother than you. Someone has to remind you that billionaires still need dinner." We talked for 15 minutes about nothing important. Her children. My impossible schedule. The charity gala she wanted me to attend next month. Before hanging up she paused. "You sound different today." "Different how?" "Less tired." I cannot explain it. After the call ended, I realized she was right. I still felt exhausted, but not empty. There was a difference. The next afternoon another surprise waited outside Sinclair Tower. As I exited the building, I noticed Grace sitting alone on a bench across the street, reading from a thick library book while slowly eating an apple. She looked peaceful for the first time since I had seen her. No expensive coffee. No designer handbag. No phone constantly demanding her attention. Just sunlight filtering through the trees and a woman completely absorbed in another world created by printed pages. A sudden gust of wind lifted several loose papers from the folder resting beside her. They scattered across the sidewalk like white birds taking flight. Before I could move, 3 strangers stepped around the pages without stopping. Grace laughed softly at her own bad luck and hurried after them. Instinct carried me forward before reason had the chance to object. I caught 2 sheets before they reached the street and another that had landed near a newspaper stand. By the time I reached her, she had gathered the rest. "I think these belong to you," I said, handing over the pages. She looked up, surprised, and our eyes met for the first time. They were a quiet shade of blue, tired but remarkably warm. "Thank you," she said with a grateful smile that appeared completely genuine. "These are my class notes. I thought I had lost them." Her voice was softer than I expected, steady despite everything life seemed to place in front of her. I noticed the title on one page. Human Services Certification Program. She was studying while working enough hours to barely afford groceries. "Important exam?" I asked. She nodded. "Very important. I have one chance to pass before tuition goes up next semester." There was no complaint in her words. Only determination. I almost introduced myself, but a car horn echoed from the curb where my driver waited. Grace glanced toward the waiting vehicle, then back at me with polite curiosity. She had no idea who I was, and strangely I preferred it that way. "Well," she said, carefully placing the papers back inside her folder, "thank you again. You saved me several hours of rewriting notes." I laughed quietly. "I am glad I arrived at the right moment." She smiled once more, lifted her worn backpack onto one shoulder, and disappeared into the afternoon crowd before I could think of another reason to keep the conversation going. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the place where she had vanished between hundreds of strangers. For the first time in years, I found myself hoping fate would interrupt my carefully planned life one more time. The city had a way of convincing people that every encounter was an accident, but by Friday afternoon I was beginning to question whether coincidence really existed. My schedule brought me to a community development conference hosted inside the New York Public Library, where Sinclair Capital had quietly funded several educational grants over the years. Normally I arrived, delivered a short speech, shook a few hands, and disappeared before anyone could ask personal questions. That afternoon felt different the moment I stepped through the marble entrance. The scent of old books mixed with fresh coffee drifted through the grand hall while students, volunteers, and nonprofit leaders filled every seat. As the keynote speaker introduced the next panel, I scanned the audience without thinking, and there she was. Grace sat near the back, balancing a notebook on her lap, writing every word with complete concentration. She was wearing the same denim jacket again, though this time I noticed she had carefully stitched one sleeve by hand where the fabric had begun to tear. Somehow that tiny repair said more about her than any biography ever could. She fixed things instead of replacing them. She adapted instead of complaining. During the question and answer session, someone asked what separated successful people from everyone else. Several executives gave predictable answers about discipline, innovation, and ambition. Then a moderator invited questions from the audience. Grace slowly raised her hand. The room grew quiet. "What happens," she asked, "when someone works as hard as they possibly can and life still keeps closing doors? How do you keep believing another one will open?" Her voice was calm, but the question carried the weight of someone who had lived it. No one answered immediately. The room seemed uncomfortable with honesty. I looked directly at her before speaking. "Sometimes success is not the first door opening," I said. "Sometimes it is refusing to stop knocking, even when no one answers for a very long time. The people who eventually change their lives are usually the ones who quietly keep showing up after everyone else has gone home." She held my gaze for one brief moment before looking down at her notebook again. I could not tell whether my answer had helped, but I hoped it had. After the conference ended, people gathered around me asking for photographs and business cards. By the time I finally stepped outside, gray clouds had returned, covering the late afternoon sun. Across the plaza I spotted Grace standing beside a small folding table where volunteers were packing leftover sandwiches and bottled water for a neighborhood shelter. Although she had attended the conference as a student, she had stayed afterwards simply to help strangers. She laughed with an elderly volunteer while carefully stacking food into paper bags as though she had nowhere else she needed to be. I watched from a distance until one of the cardboard boxes suddenly slipped from the table. Before anyone reacted, I reached it from one side while Grace caught the opposite end at exactly the same moment. We both laughed quietly at the unexpected teamwork. "Looks like we saved lunch," I said. She smiled, brushing a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "That would have been a very unfortunate ending for all these sandwiches." We finished setting the box back in place together. There was no awkwardness, no effort to impress each other, only an easy silence that felt strangely familiar. As another volunteer called Grace's name from across the plaza, she turned toward me with the same sincere smile I had begun to recognize. "Thank you, again," she said. I watched her walk away carrying 2 heavy boxes toward a waiting van, unaware that for the first time in years, I found myself wishing a business meeting would end so that an ordinary conversation could continue. The following Monday began before sunrise, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I arrived at the office thinking about someone instead of something. The elevator climbed silently toward the executive floor while my reflection stared back from polished steel. Tailored navy suit. Perfect tie. Every detail exactly where it belonged. It struck me that I had spent years organizing every visible part of my life while quietly ignoring everything that could not be measured on a balance sheet. My assistant was waiting outside my office with the morning schedule already memorized. "You have the Education Foundation luncheon at noon," she reminded me. "Several scholarship recipients will be there." I nodded without much thought until she added, "One of the local certification programs asked if a few students could attend as guests." For reasons I could not explain, I asked for the guest list. She handed me the folder, and halfway down the second page I found the name Grace Carter. I closed the folder a little too quickly. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, though the sudden change in my heartbeat suggested otherwise. The luncheon was held inside a restored historic hotel overlooking Bryant Park. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm afternoon light across polished wooden floors while conversations blended with the soft music of a string quartet. Donors, educators, students, and community leaders moved comfortably between round tables covered in white linen. I was speaking with the president of a university when I noticed Grace entering through the main doors. She paused for only a second, clearly overwhelmed by the elegance surrounding her, before straightening her shoulders and walking inside with quiet confidence. Her simple blue dress probably cost less than some guests had spent on lunch, yet somehow she carried herself with more dignity than many of the wealthiest people in the room. She greeted volunteers by name before finding an empty seat near the back instead of trying to meet influential people. That choice alone told me everything about her priorities. During lunch, the foundation director thanked several donors, including Sinclair Capital. Grace looked toward the stage with polite attention but showed no sign of recognizing my last name. Moments later the director invited me to deliver a few remarks. As I stepped onto the stage, I saw her expression change. Confusion came first. Then surprise. Finally realization. Her eyes widened just enough for me to notice before she quickly composed herself. The man who had helped gather scattered papers and lifted a cardboard box beside her was apparently the same man standing beneath the spotlight while hundreds of guests applauded. After the presentation ended, people surrounded me with congratulations and networking requests. Across the ballroom I caught sight of Grace quietly placing her untouched dessert on a passing service tray before slipping toward the exit. She was leaving without saying goodbye. I excused myself as politely as possible and followed her into the hotel courtyard. She stood near the stone fountain, looking out toward the park where early autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalks. When she heard my footsteps, she turned with an embarrassed smile. "I should have realized," she said softly. "Realized what?" I asked. "That someone driving a car like yours and giving answers like yours was never just another person walking through the city." I shook my head. "I was just another person when I picked up your notes." She looked at me for several quiet seconds before lowering her eyes. "Maybe for you," she whispered. "But people like you live in a different world than people like me." Before I could answer, she thanked me for the conversation, wished me a good afternoon, and walked toward the park without looking back. I remained beside the fountain listening to the water ripple against the stone, realizing that the greatest distance between two people was never measured in miles. Sometimes it was measured in the stories they believed about where they belonged. For the rest of that week I convinced myself that letting Grace walk away had been the right decision. She had drawn a clear line between our worlds, and I respected people who knew where their boundaries stood. At least that was the story I repeated every morning while somehow finding excuses to drive past places where I had accidentally met her before. The grocery store. The public library. The small park beside the community center. None of those detours appeared on my calendar, yet somehow they became part of my routine. Friday evening brought the first cool breeze of autumn. After 12 straight hours of meetings, I dismissed my driver earlier than usual and decided to walk the last few blocks home. The sidewalks were crowded with office workers eager to begin their weekends. Street musicians filled the air with familiar songs while food vendors called out dinner specials to passing strangers. It was the kind of ordinary evening I had spent years too busy to notice. Then I spotted Grace standing outside a neighborhood bookstore, carefully arranging folding chairs after what appeared to be a small community reading event. Children chased one another across the sidewalk while parents thanked volunteers before heading home. She laughed as a little girl handed her a drawing made with bright crayons. That simple moment made the entire street feel warmer. I almost kept walking. Instead, I crossed the street before I had the chance to change my mind. She noticed me only when I was a few feet away. Her smile faded into polite surprise. "Mr. Sinclair." I shook my head gently. "Please. Ethan." She hesitated for a second before nodding. "Ethan." Hearing my first name in her voice felt strangely unfamiliar. Most people attach titles to it. She did not. "Did you organize this?" I asked, looking toward the nearly empty bookstore. "No," she replied. "I only volunteer here on Friday evenings. The owner lets neighborhood children borrow books even if they cannot always return them on time." She smiled toward the shelves visible through the front window. "Stories deserve second chances too." I laughed softly. "That sounds like something worth supporting." She looked at me with cautious kindness. "You support plenty of things already." There was no accusation in her voice, only distance. I understood exactly what she meant. Before I could answer, an elderly man carrying 2 heavy boxes struggled to open the bookstore door. Grace immediately hurried over to help him without another word. By the time she returned, I had already made a decision. "Would you have dinner with me?" The question surprised both of us. She blinked once before lowering her eyes. "That is kind of you." It was meant sincerely. She nodded. "I know." A long silence settled between us while evening traffic flowed around the corner. Finally she spoke. "People would assume I wanted something from you. Would you?" I asked quietly. She looked directly at me. "No. But that is not the point." She folded her hands together as though searching for the right words. "I have spent years building a life where I owe no one anything except gratitude. I cannot risk confusing kindness with obligation." Her answer carried neither fear nor resentment. Only self-respect. I admired it more than she probably realized. I smiled despite the disappointment. "Then let me ask something smaller." She tilted her head curiously. "Coffee. 1 hour. 2 people talking without business cards, headlines, or expectations." Grace considered the offer while a cool breeze lifted a few loose strands of her blonde hair. Then she smiled with unmistakable warmth and gently shook her head. "Not yet, Ethan." Before I could respond, she picked up the stack of folding chairs and carried them inside the bookstore. I stood alone beneath the streetlights watching the door close behind her, realizing that every deal I had ever negotiated became meaningless beside one woman who could say no with grace and still leave me hoping she might someday say yes. Monday mornings always began with numbers. Revenue forecasts. Market reports. Investment summaries. My executive team believed every answer could be found inside a spreadsheet if they searched long enough. They had no idea the question occupying my mind had nothing to do with finance. Why had Grace's quiet refusal stayed with me longer than every standing ovation I had received that year? Most people accepted invitations because of my name. She declined because of hers. There was something deeply admirable about that. Late that afternoon, my assistant entered my office carrying a folder filled with charitable funding requests. The Literacy Initiative from West Harlem is asking if Sinclair Capital would renew its annual grant, she explained. I recognized the organization immediately. It was the same neighborhood bookstore where Grace volunteered every Friday evening. Without hesitation, I signed the approval. Then I stopped. Do not announce our involvement, I added. She looked surprised. No press release? No press release. She nodded and quietly left the office. 3 days later, I attended the bookstore for the first time, not as a donor but as another volunteer. The elderly owner, Mr. Benjamin Harris, greeted everyone with the same warm smile, never asking about occupations or bank accounts. To him, every person willing to stack books or organize shelves deserved equal appreciation. I spent the first hour unpacking donated novels while children wandered between colorful book displays searching for adventures they could take home for free. The simplicity of the work felt strangely calming. I had forgotten what it felt like to accomplish something with my own hands instead of approving it with a signature. You missed a spot. I turned and found Grace smiling as she pointed toward a shelf where several books leaned awkwardly in opposite directions. Apparently, I am better with financial reports than alphabetizing. She laughed softly. That is a surprisingly common condition. We worked side by side for several quiet minutes, placing books where they belonged. There was no awkwardness this time. No discussion about wealth or opportunity. Just two people making an old bookstore a little more welcoming before the next group of children arrived. Mr. Harris approached carrying a cardboard box filled with worn picture books. Grace, he said, would you mind reading to the little ones today? My voice is giving out. Of course, she answered without hesitation. A dozen children gathered on a colorful rug near the reading corner while Grace settled into an old wooden chair with a faded blue storybook resting across her lap. I remained in the background pretending to organize another shelf, though in truth I never turned a single page. I simply listened. Her voice transformed every sentence into something gentle and alive. She changed expressions for different characters, paused just long enough for tiny imaginations to catch up, and celebrated every eager answer the children shouted before the next page turned. Their laughter echoed through the bookstore like music. One little boy wearing oversized glasses climbed onto the chair beside her and quietly leaned against her shoulder before the story even reached the middle. Grace continued reading without missing a single word, absent-mindedly adjusting the blanket around his knees when she noticed he looked cold. No audience. No cameras. No recognition. Just instinctive kindness offered as naturally as breathing. In that moment I understood something every newspaper had failed to teach me. Compassion was not measured by how much someone could give. It was measured by how completely they gave themselves to the moment in front of them. As the final page closed, the children applauded with joyful enthusiasm. Grace looked up and caught me watching from across the room. For a brief second she seemed almost embarrassed before smiling shyly. She had no idea that I had spent years being surrounded by extraordinary achievements, yet nothing I had witnessed inside boardrooms or luxury hotels had ever felt as remarkable as watching one ordinary woman make an entire room of children believe the world was still a beautiful place. Rain returned the following week, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of blurred lights and shimmering sidewalks. I had learned enough about Grace to recognize that bad weather never stopped her. It only made her walk a little faster. Friday evening found both of us closing the bookstore after another successful reading program. Mr. Harris had already gone upstairs to finish paperwork, leaving the two of us carrying empty coffee cups and folding the last few chairs into neat rows. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. You were getting much better at alphabetizing, Grace said with a teasing smile. High praise from the professional. She laughed quietly before locking the front door behind us. The rain had grown heavier while we worked, forcing us to wait beneath the small awning outside. Cars rolled past with headlights reflecting across the wet pavement. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence revealed more than conversation ever could. Can I ask you something? I finally said. She nodded. Why do you spend every Friday here after working all week and studying at night? Grace looked across the street instead of at me. Because someone did the same thing for me once. Her answer was soft enough that I almost missed it beneath the sound of the rain. When I was 16, my father passed away after a long illness. 6 months later my mother could not keep our apartment anymore. She smiled sadly, as though remembering someone she still missed every day. For a while it felt like every door kept closing exactly when I reached it. She wrapped both hands around the empty paper cup for warmth. There was a librarian who never asked why I stayed until closing every afternoon. She only made sure there were books waiting for me. Stories became the one place where nobody expected me to be stronger than I really was. I listened without interrupting. After my mother passed away during my first year of college, I almost quit school. I thought working 2 jobs would be enough. Then Mr. Harris offered me a part-time position here. He said something I never forgot. She smiled through eyes that had quietly filled with tears she refused to let fall. He told me that surviving is important, but becoming the person who helps someone else survive is even more important. The words settled heavily inside me. Suddenly every moment I had witnessed made sense. The grocery bags. The bookstore. The children. The volunteer work. Grace had been rebuilding her own life by helping repair pieces of other people's lives. She took a slow breath before looking at me. Can I ask you something now? Anything. She studied my face carefully. Why do you always seem so alone? The question caught me completely unprepared. Reporters had asked about my investments, my companies, my childhood, even my favorite restaurants. No one had ever asked me that. I looked out at the rain, watching drops strike the sidewalk in endless patterns. My father built our company from almost nothing, I said quietly. He believed success solved every problem if you worked hard enough. I smiled without humor. When he passed away, I inherited more responsibility than I knew how to carry. I kept telling myself that after the next deal, after the next achievement, life would slow down. I shook my head gently. It never did. Grace listened without speaking. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. Do you know what I think? She asked after a long silence. I think you built an incredible life for everyone except the person living it. Her words were gentle, but they reached places inside me that years of success never had. At that exact moment my phone rang for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Another executive. Another urgent decision. I looked at the screen, then quietly pressed decline. Grace noticed the gesture but said nothing. We simply stood together beneath the awning while the rain continued falling around us, and for the first time in many years, choosing one quiet conversation over another important meeting felt like the best decision I had made all week. The following Tuesday began with the kind of phone call that changed ordinary mornings without asking permission. I was halfway through reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant entered the office without knocking, something she had never done before. Mr. Sinclair, she said carefully, there is a situation involving the West Harlem Community Bookstore. Every document on my desk suddenly became meaningless. What happened? She placed a tablet in front of me displaying a short local news article. A broken water pipe inside the aging building had flooded part of the first floor overnight. The article described damaged books, soaked furniture, and temporary closure while volunteers assessed the repairs. I was already reaching for my jacket before finishing the first paragraph. By the time I arrived, the rain had stopped, but the sidewalk outside the bookstore remained crowded with concerned neighbors carrying boxes and cleaning supplies. Mr. Harris stood near the entrance speaking with an insurance representative whose expression alone revealed the answer before I heard the words. The policy would cover only a fraction of the repairs. Grace was inside, rolling up soaked rugs while carefully stacking books that could still be saved. Her sleeves were damp, a strand of blonde hair had escaped her ponytail, and exhaustion showed beneath her eyes, yet she greeted every volunteer with the same gentle gratitude I had come to admire. She looked up when she saw me. "You did not have to come," she said softly. "I know." I picked up a box of damaged books without another word. For the next 2 hours I worked beside everyone else, carrying shelves, wiping tables, and helping move salvageable donations into a dry storage room upstairs. No one treated me differently because I refused to let them. To the volunteers I was simply Ethan, another pair of hands trying to save a place that mattered. During a short break, I found Mr. Harris sitting quietly on the back steps holding a folder filled with repair estimates. "The building is older than I thought," he admitted with a tired smile. "The repairs alone are more than we have raised in 3 years." He sighed before looking toward the bookstore door. "Grace keeps telling everyone we will find a way." He shook his head gently. "She has more faith than money." I looked through the estimates without saying anything. The numbers were insignificant compared to projects my company approved before lunch every day, yet to this neighborhood they represented the possible end of something precious. Later that afternoon, while volunteers continued cleaning inside, I stepped outside and called my chief financial officer. "I want Sinclair Community Foundation to purchase the building immediately," I said. There was silence on the other end. "Purchase it?" "Yes." "Restore every room. Replace every damaged shelf. Modernize the plumbing, heating, and electrical systems. But there is one condition." "What condition?" "No ownership announcement. The deed remains under Mr. Harris's nonprofit organization. Sinclair Foundation will simply be listed as an anonymous restoration partner." "That is unusually generous." "No," I replied quietly. "It is overdue." By sunset, construction specialists had already agreed to inspect the property the following morning. I returned inside just as Grace finished drying the last reading chair. She smiled, believing the difficult part of the day was finally over. She had no idea the future of the bookstore had already changed forever. As we locked the front door together, she looked around the room with quiet determination. "We will rebuild it somehow," she whispered, almost to herself. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace that no successful business acquisition had ever given me. "Yes," I answered, meeting her hopeful eyes. "I believe you will." She thanked me for spending the day helping everyone before walking toward the subway with tired but steady steps. I watched her disappear into the evening crowd, knowing that for the first time in my life, the most meaningful investment I had ever made would never appear on a single financial report. The restoration began faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, contractors were measuring walls, electricians inspected aging wiring, and volunteers packed thousands of books into temporary storage. The neighborhood treated the bookstore like a member of the family recovering from illness. Every afternoon people arrived carrying homemade meals, donated shelves, or simply a willingness to help. Grace seemed to know every volunteer by name. She thanked each person with the same sincerity whether they contributed 1 hour or $1,000. Watching her reminded me that leadership had very little to do with titles. Some people inspired others simply by refusing to give up. My own world, however, was becoming noticeably more complicated. During a board meeting, one of our directors questioned the unexpected transfer of foundation funds. "The restoration project exceeds the annual budget for community properties," he said, sliding the report across the polished conference table. "Several investors have already asked whether this aligns with shareholder priorities." Every eye in the room shifted toward me. Months earlier I would have answered with financial projections and public relations strategies. This time I simply folded the report closed. "Not every worthwhile investment produces quarterly returns," I said calmly. "Some produce stronger communities." A few executives exchanged uncertain glances. One director cleared his throat. With respect, that explanation may not satisfy everyone. I looked around the room before answering. Then perhaps it is time everyone remembered why this foundation exists. The meeting ended with polite agreement, but I understood the message. Some people measured success only by numbers. For the first time in my career, I found myself comfortable disappointing them. That Friday I walked to the temporary reading center the volunteers had organized inside a nearby church hall. Children sat around folding tables while Grace unpacked rescued books one careful stack at a time. The room lacked polished shelves and comfortable furniture, yet it somehow felt warmer than any luxury office I had ever entered. Mr. Harris greeted me with a smile that seemed lighter than it had in days. Whoever stepped in to save the building, he said quietly, asked for complete anonymity. He shook his head in amazement. There are still good people in this city. I smiled without saying a word. Across the room Grace finished helping a young boy choose his first chapter book before walking over to me carrying 2 paper cups filled with hot chocolate. I thought you might be tired of expensive coffee, she said, handing me one. I laughed softly. You may be right. We sat beside the tall church windows while rain tapped gently against the stained glass. Children laughed nearby as volunteers rearranged donated furniture. Grace wrapped both hands around her cup before speaking. Something wonderful happened this week. What was that? I asked, even though I already knew. Someone saved the bookstore. Her eyes sparkled with quiet relief. Nobody knows who it was. They only asked that the place stay exactly what it has always been. Free. Open. Belonging to the neighborhood. She looked down at the warm cup in her hands. Whoever they are, I hope life is as kind to them as they have been to us. Her words settled deep inside me. I had spent years receiving awards engraved with my name, yet nothing compared to hearing genuine gratitude from someone who would never know I had anything to do with it. As the afternoon faded into evening, one of the children ran over holding a drawing made with bright crayons. Miss Grace, the little girl said proudly, I drew our new bookstore. Grace admired every colorful detail before the child handed me the picture as well. In the center stood the familiar little building beneath a brilliant blue sky. Above it, written in careful uneven letters, were 4 simple words. Everybody belongs here. I stared at the drawing longer than I expected, realizing that somewhere between boardrooms and balance sheets, I had spent years searching for a place where I truly belonged. I was beginning to suspect that it had never been inside the tallest building in Manhattan. It had been waiting quietly beside a shelf full of borrowed books and a woman whose kindness had rewritten the definition of wealth. The bookstore reopened 3 weeks later beneath a bright Saturday sky that made the entire neighborhood feel new again. Fresh paint covered the walls, sturdy wooden shelves stood where damaged ones had once leaned, and sunlight poured through newly restored windows onto rows of books waiting for curious hands. Families filled the sidewalk long before the ribbon cutting began. Children carried balloons while volunteers arranged cookies and lemonade across folding tables. Mr. Harris wiped his glasses more than once, insisting it was because of the sunlight, although everyone knew it was emotion. Grace moved through the celebration greeting neighbors with the same quiet warmth she offered every person she met. Watching her smile inside the restored building made every difficult conversation with my board seem insignificant. I stayed near the back of the crowd, content to let the day belong to everyone else. Then the unexpected happened. A local television reporter arrived hoping to cover the reopening. Cameras followed Mr. Harris as he thanked volunteers and supporters. Near the end of the interview, the reporter smiled politely and asked the question I had hoped no one would ask. Do you know who funded this remarkable restoration? Mr. Harris shook his head. Only that they wished to remain anonymous. Unfortunately, one of the construction supervisors standing nearby misunderstood the intention. It was Sinclair Foundation, he answered casually. Mr. Ethan Sinclair insisted nobody announce it. The words floated through the air with surprising speed. Conversation stopped. Several people turned toward me at once. I saw Grace standing only a few feet away, her smile fading into stunned silence. For a long moment she simply looked at me without speaking. After the interview ended and the crowd drifted back toward the refreshments, she quietly walked outside into the small garden behind the bookstore. I followed a minute later. She stood beside a maple tree whose leaves had already begun turning shades of gold and crimson. "You knew," she said softly without facing me. "From the beginning." I took a slow breath. "I knew the bookstore mattered to you." She nodded once. "And you saved it anyway." "It was never about impressing you." She finally turned toward me. There was no anger in her eyes. Only disappointment mixed with something far more painful. "Do you know why this hurts?" she asked. I remained silent. "Because I believed every conversation we had existed between two ordinary people." Her voice trembled slightly before growing steady again. "Now I cannot stop wondering how many problems disappeared simply because you had the power to erase them." "Grace." She gently shook her head. "Please let me finish." She folded her arms tightly against the cool afternoon breeze. "You once asked me why I kept saying no." A sad smile crossed her face. "This is why. I never wanted to become another life that changed because someone wealthy decided to rescue it." I stepped closer but kept enough distance to respect the space she needed. "You changed my life long before I changed anything around you." She closed her eyes for a brief moment as though the words only made everything harder. "Maybe that is true." She looked back at the bookstore where children laughed through the open doorway. "But right now I do not know where your kindness ends and your influence begins." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Finally she met my eyes one last time. "I need time, Ethan." There was no accusation in those 4 words. Only honesty. I nodded because anything else would have placed my needs above hers. "Take all the time you need." She whispered a quiet thank you before walking slowly toward the subway station without looking back. I remained beneath the maple tree until the celebration ended around me, realizing that loving someone sometimes meant accepting the one decision money could never change. It meant letting them walk away and trusting that if what you built together was real, the path home would still exist when they were ready to find it. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city with crisp mornings and early sunsets. 3 months passed without a single message from Grace. I honored the promise hidden inside her request for time, even when every instinct urged me to walk back into the bookstore and explain everything again. Instead, I learned something I had never practiced before. Patience. Every Friday I continued volunteering at the bookstore whenever Mr. Harris needed help, but if Grace's schedule appeared on the calendar, I quietly traded shifts with another volunteer. The place that had once brought us together became the place where I protected the distance she had asked for. My life changed in ways the business magazines could not understand. I delegated meetings that once consumed entire weeks. I declined invitations to exclusive events that no longer interested me. Instead, I spent evenings mentoring scholarship students, reading stories to children at the bookstore, and having Sunday dinner with Olivia and her family without checking my phone every 5 minutes. My executives called it an unexpected shift in priorities. My sister simply smiled one evening across the dinner table and said, "You finally look like someone who is living instead of managing." She was right. Success had stopped feeling like a destination and started becoming a tool. Spring arrived with warmer afternoons and trees slowly turning green again. One Tuesday I visited the bookstore after receiving a handwritten invitation from Mr. Harris celebrating the first anniversary of the literacy program's expansion. The building buzzed with familiar laughter. New shelves held twice as many books as before. Children's artwork decorated the walls. Above the entrance hung the framed crayon drawing that read "Everybody belongs here." I smiled the moment I saw it. During the celebration, Mr. Harris walked beside me with his usual gentle pace. "Someone asked about you last week," he said casually. My heart answered before my voice could. "Grace?" He nodded. "She finished her certification program." Pride filled his tired eyes. "She accepted a position at a community family resource center across town." She helps struggling families find housing, educational support, and counseling. I smiled quietly. That sounds exactly like her. He glanced at me with the kind wisdom only age could earn. She never stopped believing you were a good man, Ethan. I looked at him, surprised. Then why did she leave? He chuckled softly. Because sometimes people need to discover that love grows stronger when it is no longer carrying the weight of gratitude. Those words stayed with me long after the celebration ended. Several weeks later, I left the office earlier than usual and decided to walk through Bryant Park before heading home. The afternoon sun painted long golden shadows across the grass while people read books, played chess, and enjoyed the first truly warm day of the season. Near the fountain I noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on a wooden bench with a notebook resting across her lap. Grace. She looked different. Not because her clothes had changed or because life had suddenly become perfect. She simply looked lighter. The quiet sadness I had first seen outside the hospital months earlier had softened into peaceful confidence. She glanced up as footsteps approached. Our eyes met across the park for the first time since the bookstore reopening. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply smiled, the kind of smile shared by two people who had traveled a long distance without moving very far at all. I stopped a respectful distance from the bench, prepared to keep walking if that was what she wanted. Instead, Grace closed the notebook, looked at the empty space beside her, and gently patted the bench with one hand. It was the smallest invitation anyone had ever offered me, yet it felt larger than every boardroom victory I had collected throughout my career. Without saying a single word, I sat beside her beneath the blooming trees, realizing that some doors did not open because you knocked louder. They opened because you finally learned how to wait. The afternoon drifted by without either of us trying to fill every silence. We watched children chase pigeons across the park, couples share coffee from paper cups, and an elderly man patiently teach his grandson how to play chess beneath the flowering trees. It reminded me that the most beautiful moments in life rarely announced themselves. They simply arrived while no one was paying attention. Grace finally broke the silence with a quiet smile. You waited. I looked at the fountain where sunlight danced across the water. You asked me to. She nodded slowly. Most people would have tried to convince me they were right. I laughed softly. I wanted you to find your answer instead of accepting mine. She turned toward me, studying my face as though searching for the man she had first met outside the bookstore months ago. Mr. Harris told me you never stopped volunteering. I shrugged gently. The children still needed someone to shelve books incorrectly. She laughed, the same warm laugh that had first caught my attention. You finally learned the alphabet. With excellent supervision. The laughter faded into comfortable quiet before Grace reached into her bag and removed a folded piece of paper. It was worn around the edges from being opened many times. She handed it to me. I unfolded it carefully and immediately recognized the crayon drawing from the little girl at the bookstore. Somebody had made a copy before framing the original. Across the top, in uneven handwriting, were the words "Everybody belongs here." I kept this, Grace said softly. Whenever work became difficult or I started believing I could not make a difference, I looked at that drawing. She took a slow breath. Then I realized something. I waited without speaking. The bookstore was never really saved by money. Her eyes met mine. It was saved because someone believed it was worth protecting without asking for anything in return. Emotion settled quietly between us. I spent months trying to separate your kindness from your influence, she continued. Eventually I understood they were never the same thing. I lowered my eyes for a moment before answering. Grace, I never wanted you to feel like you owed me. I know. She smiled gently. That is why I came back. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the park while the city continued moving around us, completely unaware that two ordinary lives were changing forever on a simple wooden bench. I looked at her and realized something that had taken me 34 years to understand. I used to think success meant building the tallest buildings, closing the biggest deals, and collecting more achievements than anyone else. I smiled quietly. Then I met a woman who measured wealth by borrowed books, shared meals, and whether a frightened child felt safe enough to smile. Grace reached over and lightly rested her hand on mine. The gesture was small, almost effortless, yet it carried more meaning than any applause I had ever received. "Do you remember what you told everyone at that conference?" she asked. I searched my memory. She answered before I could. "You said success sometimes means refusing to stop knocking." She smiled through eyes shining with hope instead of sadness. I think we both kept knocking. I gently intertwined my fingers with hers, not to hold on tightly, but simply to let her know I was there. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic promises, no perfect ending waiting beyond the next sentence. There was only a choice we made together beneath the spring sky. We would keep walking forward, one ordinary day at a time, building a life where neither of us needed to rescue the other because we had already learned something far more valuable. We had learned how to stand beside each other. As we rose from the bench and began walking through the park, I glanced once more at the families laughing beneath the trees and finally understood the truth that had been quietly waiting for me all along. Money can build impressive buildings. Kindness builds places that feel like home. And love, when it asks for nothing except honesty, has an extraordinary way of rebuilding the people who once believed they were beyond repair.